The dust swirled around Margaret's worn boots as she stood at the edge of the Apache camp, her heart pounding like thunder in the desert. The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape of the Arizona Territory. Behind, her 20 head of prime cattle grazed peacefully, their bells jingling softly in the warm breeze. These animals represented everything she had left in the world after her husband. Thomas abandoned her 6 months ago. Margaret clutched her faded blue dress tighter around her thin frame. At 28 years old, she had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her weathered hands told the story of countless hours working the ranch alone, trying to keep food on the table and hope alive in her heart. The cattle were her final bargaining chip, her last chance at the one thing that mattered most to her. In this harsh world, the Apache warriors watched her with curious eyes as she approached their leader. Chief Running Bear, she had heard stories about this man from the traders in town. They said he was fair but fierce, a leader who valued honor above all else. Margaret prayed those stories were true. "I come seeking the great Chief Running Bear," she called out in her clearest voice, though it trembled slightly with nerves. The camp fell silent, except for the crackling of cooking fires and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Women emerged from their dwellings, children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, and warriors set down their tools to observe this unusual visitor. An elderly Apache woman stepped forward, her silver hair braided with colorful beads that caught the sunlight. Her dark eyes held wisdom and kindness that reminded Margaret of her own grandmother back in Missouri. The woman spoke to her in broken English, asking what brought a white woman alone to their sacred lands. Margaret explained her situation as simply as she could. Her husband had left her for another woman in San Francisco, taking their life savings and leaving behind only debts and broken promises. The bank would soon claim their small ranch. Most devastating of all, Thomas had taken their 5-year-old daughter Emma with him, claiming Margaret was unfit to raise a child alone on the frontier. "I have tried everything," Margaret said, tears streaming down her sunburned cheeks. "The law will not help me. They say a husband has the right to take his child wherever he chooses. The church ladies in town whispered that I must have driven him away somehow. But I know the truth. Emma needs her mother, and I need her more than I need to breathe." Chief Running Bear emerged from the largest dwelling in the camp. He was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet authority that commanded respect. His long, black hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and intricate beadwork decorated his leather clothing. Despite the stories she had heard about Apache fierceness, his face showed only thoughtful consideration as he listened to her plea. The chief studied the cattle, grazing nearby. These were fine animals, well-fed and healthy despite the drought that had plagued the territory for months. He knew their value in both practical and trading terms, as people needed livestock to supplement their food stores for the coming winter. The cattle could mean the difference between prosperity and hunger for many families in his tribe. Margaret fell to her knees in the dusty earth, her voice breaking as she made her desperate offer. "I will give you all 20 cattle in return. For one favor, help me get my daughter back from her father. I know your people are skilled at tracking and moving through the wilderness unseen. I know you have connections with traders who travel to California. Please, I am begging you. These cattle are worth more than most people see in a year, but they mean nothing to me without Emma." The camp remained silent as Chief Running Bear considered her words. In Apache culture, children were precious beyond measure, and the bond between mother and child was considered sacred. He had seen too many families torn apart by the chaos of frontier life. Too many children left orphaned or abandoned by circumstances beyond their control. Something in Margaret's desperate plea touched a chord in his heart he had not felt in years. But helping her would mean significant risk for his people. The relationship between Apaches and white settlers was fragile at best, often erupting into violence over misunderstandings or competing claims to land and resources. Taking action against a white man, even one who had abandoned his family, could bring unwanted attention from the territorial government and military forces. Chief Running Bear asked Margaret to tell him more about her husband and daughter. Where exactly had they gone? Did she have any recent information about their whereabouts? What kind of man was Thomas, and would he be likely to give up the child willingly if approached diplomatically? Margaret explained that Thomas had joined a wagon train headed for the California goldfields, hoping to strike it rich and start a new life with his younger mistress. He had always been a dreamer, quick to chase after get-rich-quick schemes, but slow to take responsibility for his actions. She believed he saw Emma as a burden rather than a blessing, keeping her only to spite his abandoned wife as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange. In purple, Chief Running Bear made his decision. The cattle were valuable, but more important was the opportunity to demonstrate Apache honor and compassion. His people had their own code of ethics that transcended the petty prejudices and legal complications of white society. "We will help. You find your daughter," he announced to the assembled tribe. "But first, you must prove your commitment to this path. Stay with us for 1 week. Learn our ways, show respect for our customs, and demonstrate that your love for your child is stronger than your fear of the unknown. If you can do this, we will begin the journey to bring Emma home." Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in months. The morning sun painted the Apache camp in golden light as Margaret woke from her first night sleeping on the hard ground. Her back ached terribly, and her city-bred bones protested every movement. The elderly woman who had first spoken to her, called Gentle Moon, had provided a simple bedroll and a place near the women's fire. Throughout the long night, Margaret had listened to unfamiliar sounds of desert life and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Gentle Moon approached with a bowl of warm corn mush and strips of dried meat. The food was different from anything Margaret had eaten before, but hunger made everything taste acceptable. As she ate, children gathered around to stare at her pale skin and light brown hair. Their curiosity was innocent but intense. Margaret found herself smiling at their whispered conversations in the Apache language. "Chief." Running Bear appeared as she finished her simple breakfast. In daylight, she could see the intelligence and strength that had made him a leader among his people. His presence commanded respect without demanding fear, a quality that reminded Margaret of her late father, who had been a respected judge back in Missouri. "Today you begin to understand our ways," the chief told her. "My sister, Bright Star, will teach you how Apache women work and live. You must show that you can survive hardship and contribute to our community. Only then will we know you have the strength needed for the dangerous journey ahead." Bright Star was a woman of about 35 with kind eyes and gentle hands, despite her obviously hard life. She led Margaret through the daily routine of Apache women, starting with the gathering of roots and plants from the desert floor. Margaret had always considered herself capable, having managed a ranch for months alone, but this was entirely different knowledge. The desert that had seemed empty and hostile yesterday revealed itself to be full of life and resources under Bright Star's guidance. Hidden among the seemingly barren rocks and sand were edible roots, medicinal plants, and materials for crafting essential tools. Margaret learned to identify which cacti fruits were safe to eat, how to find water sources by reading the landscape, and where to locate the clay needed for making pottery. Her soft hands, accustomed to household tasks and ranch work, quickly developed blisters from digging roots and gathering thorny plants. Bright Star showed her how to wrap her palms with strips of leather and which plants could soothe the pain of cuts and scratches. Every lesson came with stories about Apache history and traditions, helping Margaret understand the deep connection these people had with their harsh but beautiful homeland. By midday, the temperature had risen to nearly unbearable levels. Margaret's fair skin burned despite her bonnet, and sweat soaked through her cotton dress. The Apache women seemed unaffected by the heat, moving efficiently through their tasks, while Margaret struggled to keep pace. Began to understand why. Desert survival required knowledge passed down through generations. In the afternoon, Bright Star taught her the art of basket weaving using plant fibers gathered that morning. Margaret's first attempts were clumsy disasters, but she persisted. With determination, the repetitive motion of weaving gave her time to think about Emma and worry about what her daughter might be experiencing on the long journey to California. As evening approached, Margaret joined the women in preparing the communal meal. She learned to grind corn into flour using traditional stone tools, her arms aching from the unfamiliar motions. The work was harder than anything she had done on the ranch, but there was something satisfying about contributing to the welfare of the entire community. That night around the fire, Chief Running Bear spoke to the assembled tribe about their guest situation. He explained how her husband had broken the sacred bonds of family by taking their child away from her mother. Many of the Apache nodded in understanding, having witnessed similar tragedies in their own experiences with white society. An old warrior named Grey Wolf stood to speak. His weathered face bore the scars of many battles, and his voice carried the weight of years spent defending his people. He told the story of his own daughter, taken years ago by soldiers and never seen again. The pain in his eyes was still fresh despite the passage of time. The bond between mother and child is sacred, Grey Wolf said in his halting English, clearly struggling with the unfamiliar language. White man's law may say husband owns child like he owns horse, but Apache law says child belongs with thee. One who loves most truly, this woman's heart speaks truth. We should help her. The tribal members shared their own stories of loss and separation. Margaret began to understand that her personal tragedy was part of a much larger pattern of families destroyed by the conflicts and changes sweeping across the Western territories. The Apache people had suffered their own share of broken families and stolen children. On her third night in the camp, Margaret woke to the sound of someone crying softly in the darkness. She discovered it was Bright Star, weeping over a small bundle of child's clothing. Through gentle questioning, Margaret learned that Bright Star had lost her own son to a fever 2 years earlier. The shared experience of maternal loss created an immediate bond between the two women despite their different backgrounds. Bright Star began teaching Margaret more advanced survival skills, including how to read weather signs and track animals across rocky terrain. She explained that the journey to find Emma would be dangerous and difficult, requiring endurance and knowledge that few white women possessed. Margaret absorbed every lesson with fierce determination, knowing her daughter's future depended on her ability to adapt and survive. By the end of her first week in the Apache camp, Margaret had changed significantly. Her soft hands had grown calloused and strong. Her pale skin had darkened from sun exposure, and her movements had become more efficient and purposeful. Most importantly, she had gained the respect of the Apache women through her willingness to work hard and learn their ways. Chief Running Bear watched her progress with approval. This white woman had shown courage and determination that impressed even his most skeptical warriors. She had proven that her love for her daughter was stronger than her fear of hardship or her prejudices about Apache life. On the 7th evening, as promised, the chief called Margaret to his dwelling for an important conversation about the next phase of their agreement. Chief Running Bear's dwelling was larger than the others, decorated with beautiful blankets and weapons that told the story of his people's proud heritage. Margaret sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her body now comfortable with positions that would have been impossible for her just a week ago. Transformation in her appearance was remarkable. Gone was the desperate, broken woman who had arrived at their camp. In her place sat someone stronger, more determined. With eyes that held new knowledge and purpose, the chief studied her face in the flickering light of the small fire that burned in the center of the space. He had watched her progress carefully, noting not just her willingness to work, but her genuine respect for Apache customs and people. Many white settlers viewed his tribe as savages, but Margaret had approached their culture with open curiosity and humble gratitude. "You have proven your commitment," Running Bear said slowly, choosing his English words with care. "Now we must speak of the dangerous path ahead. Your husband has taken your daughter to California, a journey of many weeks through hostile territory. Even if we find them, bringing the child back will not be simple. Are you prepared for what this mission might require?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. The week among his people had taught her that survival often demanded difficult choices. She had seen Apache warriors make sacrifices for their families that white society would never understand or accept. Her own situation required similar courage and determination. "I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to bring Emma home," she replied. These past days have shown me that I am stronger than I believed possible. Your people have given me hope and taught me skills I never knew I needed. I will not waste this chance." Running Bear nodded approvingly. He had already formulated a plan, but it would require assistance from tribal members who had connections throughout the territory. His nephew, Swift Arrow, was a skilled tracker who had worked as a scout for various wagon trains. Another warrior called Mountain Cat had traveled extensively through California during trading expeditions. "We have received word from traders that your husband's wagon train encountered difficulties near the Colorado River," the chief explained. "A broken axle delayed them for several days, and sickness has spread among the travelers. They are moving much slower than planned, which gives us an advantage." Margaret's heart clenched with worry. If Emma was sick or suffering, every day of delay could make her condition worse. The thought of her little daughter struggling with illness while surrounded by strangers made her feel desperate and helpless again. But she forced herself to remain calm. Knowing that panic would not help anyone, Running Bear continued his explanation of the rescue plan. Swift Arrow would travel ahead to locate the wagon train and assess the situation. He would pose as a hunting guide seeking work, a common enough sight on the frontier that it would not arouse suspicion. Once he determined Emma's exact circumstances, he would send word back to the main group. Margaret and a small party of Apache warriors would follow several days behind, traveling light and fast through routes known only to the tribe. They would avoid main trails used by military patrols and other travelers who might report their movement to territorial authorities. The journey would be difficult, requiring them to travel mostly at night and rest during the hot desert days. "Your husband may not give up the child willingly," Running Bear warned. "White men often view children as property rather than precious gifts to be protected. We must be prepared for the possibility that he will refuse to cooperate, even when confronted." With evidence of his abandonment and cruelty, Margaret had considered this possibility many times during her week in the camp. Thomas had always been selfish and vindictive, especially when he felt challenged or cornered. He might try to use Emma as a weapon against her, threatening harm. If she persisted in trying to reclaim their daughter, the thought made her sick with fear, but it also strengthened her resolve. That evening, the entire tribe gathered for a ceremony to bless the upcoming journey. Margaret was honored to be included in this sacred ritual, understanding that it represented the Apache people's formal commitment to her cause. Gentle Moon painted traditional symbols on her forehead using clay and plant dyes, explaining that these marks would provide spiritual protection during the dangerous mission ahead. Swift Arrow approached her as the ceremony concluded. He was a man of perhaps 25 years, with the lean build and watchful eyes of someone accustomed to danger. His English was better than most of the other warriors, learned during his work as a scout for various frontier expeditions. "I leave at dawn," he told her simply. "In 10 days, if all goes well, I will send word about your daughter's location and condition. You must use that time to prepare yourself for hardships worse than anything you have experienced here. The desert between here and California has claimed many lives, and we will be traveling through territory controlled by hostile tribes and dangerous men." Gret spent her remaining days in the camp learning advanced survival techniques from Brightstar and the other women. They taught her how to find water in seemingly impossible places, which desert plants could sustain life during emergencies, and how to navigate by reading the stars. Every lesson might mean the difference between life and death during the long journey ahead. Gentle Moon gifted her with traditional Apache clothing better suited for desert travel than her cotton dress. The deerskin garments were comfortable and durable, designed to protect against thorns, rocks, and temperature extremes. Margaret felt strange wearing clothes so different from her familiar frontier attire, but she recognized the practical wisdom behind their construction. The waiting period was the most difficult part of her entire ordeal. During the day, she stayed busy learning new skills, but at night her mind filled with worries about Emma. Was her daughter sick? Was she frightened and crying for her mother? Did Thomas treat her kindly, or had his resentment toward Margaret extended to their innocent child? On the 8th day, a young warrior arrived at the camp with news that chilled Margaret's blood. Swift Arrow had found the wagon train, but the situation was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Thomas was indeed traveling with Emma and his mistress, but the little girl had fallen seriously ill with fever. Worse yet, Thomas seemed to care more about his new woman's comfort than his daughter's health. According to Swift Arrow's message, Emma was being cared for primarily by other women in the wagon train, while Thomas spent his time gambling and drinking with the men. The child was weak and listless, calling for her mother in her delirium. Several travelers had criticized Thomas for his neglect, but he dismissed their concerns with anger and crude language. Chief Running Bear called Margaret to his dwelling immediately upon receiving this news. The situation had become even more urgent than they had anticipated. Emma needed her mother's care, and she needed it soon. The rescue mission could no longer wait for ideal conditions or perfect planning. The stars were still visible in the pre-dawn sky when Margaret and her Apache companions began their desperate journey across the harsh desert landscape. Chief Running Bear had chosen 3 of his most trusted warriors for this mission. Mountain Cat, a silent man with eyes like a hawk who could track anything across any terrain. Grey Wolf, the elderly warrior who understood the pain of losing a child. And Young Thunder, barely 20 years old but already proven in battle and blessed with the speed of his namesake. Margaret rode, sturdy Apache pony that seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. The animal moved with sure-footed confidence. Across rocky terrain that would have challenged horses unfamiliar with desert conditions, she had learned to ride Apache style during her time in the camp, sitting differently than the formal English manner she had been taught as a girl back. In Missouri, they traveled in single file, following ancient paths known only to the Apache people. These routes wound between towering rock formations and through hidden valleys, where springs provided precious water for both humans and animals. Mountain Cat led the way, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes and adjusting their course to avoid patrols of territorial soldiers who might question their presence in these lands. The first day's travel was brutal. The sun climbed mercilessly high, turning the desert into a furnace that seemed determined to cook every living thing. Margaret's new Apache clothing provided better protection than her old cotton dress, but sweat still poured down her face and soaked her garments. She forced herself to drink small sips of water at regular intervals, remembering bright stars, warnings about the dangers of dehydration by evening. They had covered nearly 40 miles of difficult terrain. Margaret's body ached in places she had never noticed before, but she felt proud of her ability to keep pace with experienced Apache warriors. They made camp in a hidden canyon where a tiny stream provided fresh water and shelter from the wind that swept across the open desert at night. Young Thunder proved to be an excellent cook, preparing a meal from dried meat, wild roots, and herbs. Gathered along their route, as they ate around a small, carefully concealed fire, Grey Wolf told stories of his own adventures in this harsh but beautiful landscape. His tales helped pass the time and distracted Margaret from worrying about Emma's condition. On the second day, they encountered their first serious danger. Mountain Cat spotted dust clouds in the distance that indicated a large group of riders heading in their direction. Using hand signals, he directed the party to take shelter among a cluster of massive boulders where they could observe without being seen. The approaching riders turned out to be a cavalry patrol searching for Apache raiders who had allegedly stolen cattle from a nearby ranch. Margaret held her breath as the soldiers passed within a few hundred yards of their hiding place. If discovered, the warriors would be arrested or killed, and she would never reach Emma in time to provide the medical care her daughter desperately needed. Young Thunder whispered to Margaret that this was exactly why Apache people avoided contact with white authorities whenever possible. Even peaceful missions like theirs could be misunderstood and result in violence. The territorial government's policy was to treat all Apache movement as potentially hostile, making their rescue mission extremely dangerous for everyone involved. The patrol disappeared over a distant ridge. They continued their journey with increased caution. Mountain Cat chose even more remote routes, leading them through terrain so rugged that Margaret wondered how any human being had ever learned to navigate such country. The Apache knowledge of their homeland seemed almost supernatural in its precision and depth. On the third evening, they made contact with Swift Arrow at a predetermined location near a distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping giant. He had disturbing news about Emma's condition. The little girl's fever had worsened, and she was becoming weaker each day. Thomas showed no concern for his daughter's health, instead spending his time pursuing romantic interests with his new woman. The child calls for her mother constantly, Swift Arrow reported in his careful English. Other travelers in the wagon train have tried to help, but they have their own families to worry about. Thomas tells them the girl is just homesick and will recover once they reach California. He refuses to consider turning back or seeking proper medical attention. Margaret felt rage building in her chest like a fire fed by wind. How could any father be so callous about his own child's suffering? She had always known Thomas was selfish and irresponsible. But this level of cruelty exceeded even her worst expectations of his character. Grey Wolf placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow we will be close enough to act," he said. In his broken but sincere English, "Your daughter will know her mother's love again soon. Apache warriors do not fail when protecting children." Swift Arrow had identified the perfect location for their rescue attempt. The wagon train would camp the following evening, beside a river where the travelers needed to rest their animals and repair equipment damaged during the difficult desert crossing. The camp would be spread out along the riverbank, making it easier to approach Emma without alerting the entire group to their presence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret would approach the camp openly, claiming to have been searching for her daughter since discovering Thomas had taken her to California. This would not arouse suspicion, since abandoned wives seeking their children were not uncommon on the frontier. She distracted Thomas and created confusion. The Apache warriors would position themselves to ensure a safe escape route. If Thomas agreed to return Emma voluntarily, they would depart peacefully and begin the long journey back to Arizona territory. If he refused or became violent, the warriors were prepared to take stronger action to protect both mother and child. Grey Wolf made it clear that no harm would come to innocent travelers, but they would not allow Thomas to continue endangering Emma's life through neglect. That night, as Margaret tried to sleep under the brilliant desert stars, she found herself remembering better times with Emma. She recalled teaching her daughter to read using an old Bible, watching her play with dolls made from corn husks, and holding her close during thunderstorms. Those precious memories gave her strength for the confrontation that awaited her the next evening. Young Thunder took the first watch, his keen eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Margaret drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of Emma's sweet voice calling for her mama.
Oh.
In her dreams, she could see her daughter's face clearly, pale and frightened, but still beautiful with the innocent trust that only children possess. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the knowledge that this day would determine Emma's future and possibly cost lives in the process. Margaret rose before the sun, checking her weapons and reviewing the plan one final time with her Apache companions. Everything depended on timing, courage, and the hope that a mother's love could overcome the selfishness and cruelty of an unworthy father. The wagon train stretched along the muddy riverbank like a collection of weathered toys abandoned by some giant child. Margaret crouched behind a screen of cottonwood trees, her heart hammering against her ribs as she studied the scene before her. After days of desperate travel across the unforgiving desert, she was finally close enough to see the people who had unknowingly become part of her daughter's story. Families clustered around their wagons, tending cooking fires and mending equipment damaged by the harsh journey. Children played in the shallow water while their mothers washed clothes and prepared evening meals. The scene looked peaceful and normal, making it hard to believe that somewhere among these innocent travelers, her Emma was suffering from fever and neglect. Mountain Cat pointed silently toward a wagon positioned slightly apart from the others. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that this camp was different. While other families worked together efficiently, this group seemed disorganized and troubled. A woman with bright blonde hair sat on a wooden crate, fanning herself with obvious annoyance. A man she recognized as Thomas lounged nearby, drinking from a bottle and paying no attention to his surroundings. Margaret's trained eyes, sharpened by weeks of Apache teaching, searched for any sign of Emma among the scattered belongings around Thomas's wagon. Her breath caught in her throat when she spotted a small figure lying motionless on a blanket in the wagon's shade. Even from 50 yards away, she could see that the child was too still, Quiet for a healthy 5-year-old. Grey Wolf touched her arm gently, reminding her of their carefully planned approach. She would enter the camp from the main trail, appearing to be a lone traveler seeking information about her missing family. The Apache warriors would remain hidden, but positioned to provide assistance if the situation became dangerous. Everything depended on her ability to stay calm and convincing during the initial confrontation. Margaret checked her appearance one final time, making sure she looked like a desperate mother who had been traveling alone for weeks. Clothing and sun-darkened skin would support her story of crossing the desert in search of her daughter. She carried a small pack with basic supplies and a letter from a fictional preacher in Tucson who had supposedly helped her locate the wagon train. As she walked into the camp, conversations gradually stopped and curious faces turned in her direction. Frontier communities were always interested in newcomers, especially lone women who appeared to be traveling without male protection. Margaret forced herself to move with the exhausted determination of someone who had pushed herself beyond normal limits. "Excuse me," she called out to a middle-aged woman stirring a pot of beans over a cooking fire. "I'm looking for my husband Thomas Mitchell and our daughter, Emma. I heard they might be traveling with this wagon train to California."
Ow.
The woman's expression immediately showed sympathy and understanding. "Oh, my dear, you must be the wife he mentioned. They're here, but I'm afraid your little girl has taken quite ill. She's been running a fever for days now, and the poor thing keeps calling for her mama." Margaret felt her knees weaken with relief and terror. Emma was alive, but the confirmation of her illness made every minute of delay potentially fatal. She forced herself to continue the charade of surprised discovery rather than revealing that she had known about Emma's condition for days. "Where are they camped?" she asked, allowing genuine desperation to color her voice. "I've been searching for weeks, following every rumor and clue I could find. When Thomas left with Emma, he didn't tell me where they were going." The helpful woman pointed toward Thomas's wagon, her face showing disapproval. "I have to tell you, ma'am, your husband hasn't been taking proper care of that child. Most of us women have tried to help when we could, but he gets angry if we interfere too much. Says she's just homesick and will be fine once we reach the goldfields." Margaret thanked the woman and began walking toward Thomas's camp, her heart pounding with anticipation and fury. As she drew closer, she could hear Emma's weak voice calling out feverishly for her mother. The sound nearly broke her resolve to maintain her cover story, but she forced herself to continue the careful approach. Thomas looked up from his bottle with bleary confusion as Margaret appeared at the edge of his camp. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, anger, and finally a calculating look that she remembered all too well from their marriage. His new woman, who looked barely 20 years old, stared at Margaret with obvious hostility. "Well," Thomas said, his words slightly slurred from drinking. "Look what the desert dragged in. I should have known you'd come chasing after us like some kind of bloodhound. Can't you just accept that our marriage is over and leave us in peace?" Margaret ignored his words and rushed to the wagon where Emma lay on a pile of dirty blankets. Her daughter looked terribly small and fragile, her usually bright eyes dull with fever. Emma's face was flushed and hot to the touch, and her breathing seemed labored and irregular. Margaret felt rage building in her chest as she realized how seriously ill her child had become. "Emma, sweetheart, Mama's here," she whispered, gathering the little girl into her arms. Emma's eyes focused with difficulty, and a weak smile crossed her fevered face. "Mama, is it really you?" Emma's voice was barely audible, but the joy in her words was unmistakable. "Yes. I've been so sick, and I wanted you so much. Daddy's friend doesn't like me, and nobody takes care of me like you do." Thomas stumbled to his feet, swaying slightly from the effects of alcohol and travel fatigue. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice turning aggressive. "You can't just waltz in here and take my daughter. I'm her father, and I have legal rights. Besides, she's not as sick as she's pretending to be. Children always exaggerate their symptoms to get attention." Margaret looked up at her former husband with eyes that blazed with maternal fury. "Legal rights? You abandoned both of us without? A word took our life savings and dragged this child across the desert while she was seriously ill. What kind of father does that to his own daughter? The blonde woman spoke for the first time, her voice shrill and demanding. Thomas, you said she was just a whiny little girl who would get over missing her mother? You didn't tell me she was? This sick. I don't want to be responsible for taking care of somebody else's brat, especially if she might die on us. Margaret felt the situation spiraling toward dangerous confrontation. Thomas's face was darkening with anger, and she could see him working up to one of the violent rages that had made their marriage so miserable. In the growing darkness, she caught a glimpse of movement among the trees that told her the Apache warriors were positioning themselves for action. Thomas stepped forward menacingly, his fists clenched and his face twisted with the familiar rage that Margaret remembered from their worst fights. The alcohol on his breath mixed with the smell of sweat and unwashed clothes, creating an aura of violence that made several nearby travelers look up from their evening activities with concern. You think you can just show up and take what's mine? He snarled, grabbing for Emma despite the child's obvious weakness. I don't care how sick she is. She stays with me, and there's nothing you can do about it. The law says a man's children belong to him, not some hysterical woman who can't even keep a husband satisfied. Margaret pulled Emma closer, feeling her daughter's fevered body trembling against her chest. The little girl whimpered with fear as her father's voice rose to a shout that echoed across the entire camp. Their families began gathering at a respectful distance, clearly uncomfortable, with the domestic drama unfolding before them but unwilling to interfere in what appeared to be a private family matter. Thomas, please, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable despite the fury burning in her heart. Look at her. She's desperately ill and needs proper medical care. Whatever problems we have between us, surely you can see that Emma needs her mother right now. The blonde woman laughed harshly, a sound like breaking glass that made Emma flinch and cry out weakly. Oh, isn't that touching? The abandoned wife thinks she can guilt us into giving up our traveling companion. Oh. Well, I've got news for you, honey. Thomas and I are starting a new life in California, and we don't need any reminders of his past mistakes following us around. Margaret felt something dangerous stirring in her chest, a protective rage that her weeks with the Apache had taught her to recognize and channel. Emma was burning with fever, possibly dying. While these two selfish adults argued about her like she was a piece of property, the injustice of it made Margaret's vision blur with anger. Past mistakes? Margaret's voice dropped to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. This child is not a mistake. She is a precious human being who deserves love and care from the people who brought her into this world. Thomas reached for his gun, a movement that proved to be a fatal error in judgment. He had forgotten that the frontier was full of dangers. Beyond angry wives, and that some of those dangers had been watching this confrontation with growing concern for the sick child's welfare. Gray. Wolf emerged from the shadows, like a ghost made of moonlight and vengeance. His weathered hand closed over Thomas's wrist before the gun could clear its holster, applying pressure that made the younger man gasp with pain and drop the weapon into the dirt. Apache custom says children belong with those who love them most, Gray Wolf announced in his careful English, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived countless battles. This woman crossed the desert to save her daughter. This man let the child nearly die from fever while he drank and played with his woman. Apache justice is clear. Mountain Cat and Young Thunder materialized from different directions surrounding Thomas and his mistress with the silent efficiency of experienced warriors. The other travelers in the camp began backing away, recognizing that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple family dispute. Thomas tried to bluster and threaten, but his voice cracked with fear as he realized the gravity of his situation. You can't do this. This is kidnapping. When we reach the next town, I'll have the law after all of you. Apache or not, you can't steal a white man's child. Young Thunder spoke for the first time, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. White man's law says you can take child from mother, but Apache law says child belongs where she is loved and protected. Your law is broken. Our law is strong. Margaret stood slowly, Emma cradled in her arms, and faced the crowd of travelers who had gathered to witness this confrontation. Many of them were families with children of their own, and she could see understanding and sympathy in their faces as they looked at her sick daughter. "This man abandoned us without warning, taking our life savings and our child," she announced to the assembled crowd. "He has allowed Emma to become seriously ill through neglect while he pursued his own pleasures. I ask you as parents yourselves, is this justice?" A middle-aged man stepped forward from the crowd. Margaret recognized him as the wagon train's elected leader, a position that gave him authority to mediate disputes among the travelers. His face showed the weathered wisdom of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. "I've been watching this situation for days," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "That little girl has been crying for her mother, while her father ignored her suffering. Maybe the law gives him rights, but sometimes the law is wrong. Sometimes we have to choose between what's legal and what's right." Other voices began joining in support of Margaret's cause. Women who had tried to help Emma during her illness spoke up about Thomas's callous indifference to his daughter's condition. Men who had witnessed his drinking and gambling criticized his priorities and character. Even some who might normally side with a husband's legal rights found themselves unable to defend such obvious neglect of a sick child. The blonde woman realized that popular opinion was turning against them and began retreating toward their wagon. "This is insane," she shrieked. "You can't let some savage Indians and a crazy woman steal that child. Thomas, do something." But Thomas had lost the will to fight. Faced with armed Apache warriors, an angry crowd of fellow travelers, and the undeniable evidence of his own failures as a father, he seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. The combination of alcohol, guilt, and fear had stripped away his bluster and revealed the weak, selfish man beneath. "Take her then," he muttered, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I never wanted the responsibility anyway, just alone to continue our journey in peace." Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she looked down at Emma's fevered features. Her daughter's eyes were closed, but she was breathing more steadily now that she was back in her mother's arms. The long nightmare of separation was finally coming to an end. Grey Wolf approached and gently touched Emma's forehead, his experienced eyes assessing her condition. "The child is very sick, but Apache medicine can help. We must begin the journey home immediately, traveling through the cool night hours to avoid stressing her further." The wagon train leader stepped forward with a small leather pouch in his hands. "This is medicine money collected from several families who wanted to help your daughter," he said quietly. "It's not much, but it might buy supplies you need for the journey back." As Margaret prepared to leave with her Apache rescuers, she took one last look at Thomas and his mistress. They were already packing their belongings, eager to distance themselves from the judgment of their fellow travelers. Thomas never even glanced toward his daughter, confirming Margaret's belief that Emma would be better off without such a father in her life. The stars were brilliant overhead as the small rescue party began their long journey back to the Apache camp where Emma could receive proper care. Margaret rode carefully, holding her daughter close and feeling the fever gradually beginning to break as they moved through the cool desert night. 3 weeks later, Emma was fully recovered and thriving. In the Apache camp that had become their temporary home, Margaret had learned that Chief Running Bear's promise extended beyond just rescuing her daughter. The Apache people had offered them a place in their community for as long as they needed shelter and protection. Emma delighted in learning Apache games and customs from the other children, while Margaret continued developing the survival skills that would serve them well in their new frontier life. The 20 cattle had been well spent, purchasing not just her daughter's rescue, but also a new family among people who valued love and loyalty above legal technicalities. As Margaret watched Emma playing with her new Apache friends in the golden light of the desert sunset, she knew that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources. Her desperate bargain with strangers had transformed both their lives in ways she could never have imagined.